Listen closely, my friend, because when we speak of medieval battles, we are not talking about legends carved in stone or tales polished by romance. We are talking about living men standing shoulder to shoulder, staring into the grim reality of steel, strategy, and survival. The Middle Ages were not an age of reckless chaos, as many suppose. No, these battles were measured, intentional, and deadly serious. Before a single sword was raised, decisions had already been made that would determine who lived and who fell. War, then as now, was never an accident. A medieval battle began long before the armies met. Commanders studied the land carefully. Hills, rivers, forests, and narrow roads were not scenery, they were weapons. High ground could turn a smaller force into a mighty one. Mud could cripple armored knights. A river at the wrong moment could spell disaster. Strategy was the unseen hand guiding every movement. Now let me tell you something important. Medieval soldiers did not fight alone. Battles were collective efforts, tightly organized. Infantry formed the backbone of most armies. Men with spears, shields, and discipline drilled into them through long preparation. They were trained to hold the line, to stand firm when fear whispered for them to run. Cavalry, those mounted knights so often romanticized, were not lone heroes charging blindly. They were shock troops used at precise moments. A cavalry charge, when timed correctly, could shatter an enemy formation like glass. But mistimed, it could lead to ruin. A fallen horse could mean death, trampled under hooves and boots alike. Archers and crossbowmen, though often overlooked, could decide battles before they truly began. Arrows darkened the sky, not for spectacle, but for purpose, to break morale, to thin ranks, to sow confusion. A soldier wounded before reaching the enemy line often never returned home. Armor, too, was not a guarantee of safety. Chainmail, helmets, shields all offered protection, but they were heavy, exhausting, and unforgiving. A man in armor could fight fiercely for only so long before fatigue set in, and once a soldier fell, armor became a burden, not a blessing. Leadership was everything. A strong commander could steady frightened men with a single command. A weak one could doom an army with hesitation. Medieval battles did not allow for endless corrections. Mistakes were paid for immediately, and in blood. And let us speak honestly about fear. These men were afraid. They felt the ground shake beneath marching feet. They heard the cries of the wounded. They smelled iron, sweat, and earth. Faith often carried them forward, faith in God, in their Lord, in the men beside them. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was obedience in spite of it. Most medieval battles were not long affairs. They were swift and brutal. Once a line broke, the battle was often over. Retreat turned into rout. Survival depended on staying upright, staying aware, and staying with your fellows. Victory did not always mean celebration. The field afterward was silent, but for groans and prayers. Those who survived knew they had been spared, not because they were strongest, but because they endured. So, when we speak of medieval warfare, remember this. It was not just steel that decided the outcome, nor strategy alone. It was the human will, to endure, to stand firm when everything in the body said flee. Steel gave them tools. Strategy gave them direction, but survival was the true victory. And that, my friend, is how medieval battles were fought. Medieval battles were not chaotic brawls, but carefully ordered events shaped by discipline and command tonight. We're drifting back in time, far back, to an age of mud, mail armor, and very loud opinions about whose flag belonged on which hill. So get comfortable, dim the lights a little more than you already have. Let your phone rest somewhere it can gently warm your hand. And let's talk, slowly and calmly, about medieval battles. Because despite what films, paintings, and overly enthusiastic history teachers may have suggested, medieval battles were not endless swirling riots of people swinging swords until the budget ran out. They were planned, they were deliberate, and most of the time, They were over far more quickly than anyone involved would have liked. Now, before a single man lifted a spear or muttered a prayer, he only half believed. Medieval warfare began with planning. Lots of it, usually done by men who had never personally carried a shield, but felt deeply confident about telling others where to stand. Commanders obsessed over terrain, and by obsessed, I mean they stared at hills the way modern people stare at Wi-Fi bars. High ground was everything. A slope could decide the fate of kingdoms. A muddy field could turn noble cavalry into expensive, slipping problems. Armies did not wander aimlessly into one another like confused cattle. They marched with intent slowly, painfully slowly, sometimes so slowly that both sides camped for days, staring across a valley, waiting for the other to blink first. And blinking first in medieval warfare was usually fatal. Let's ease gently into the idea that medieval soldiers were, for the most part, trained. Not uniformly well trained, but trained enough to know that running alone towards sharp objects was a bad life choice. Infantry formed the heart of medieval armies. These were the foot soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, younger sons and men who had been promised things like honor and pay in roughly equal measure. They carried spears, pikes, shields, and sometimes swords if they were feeling ambitious. They stood in formations, actual formations, lines and blocks designed to keep everyone alive just a little longer than the enemy. And that was the key goal, not glory, not heroics, just staying upright. The spear, for example, was not glamorous. It did not look impressive in paintings, but it was long, cheap, and very good at convincing charging enemies to reconsider their plans. A wall of spears was terrifying, mostly because it worked. Infantry were taught to hold, to stay close, to trust the man beside them not to panic. This did not always go well naturally. Humans being humans, panic was a frequent guest on medieval battlefields. But discipline mattered. An army that held its formation usually won. An army that broke apart usually did not live long enough to complain about it. Now let's drift gently toward the knights, because of course we must. Medieval knights were not lone champions roaming the battlefield like heavily armed poets. They were part of a system, a very expensive system that required horses, armor, squires, and enough money to bankrupt several villages. Cavalry charges were carefully timed. Despite popular imagery, knights did not simply lower their lances and sprint at the nearest problem. A charge required coordination, space, and the right moment. If executed properly, a cavalry charge was devastating. The weight of horse and rider, moving together, could shatter infantry lines like pottery. But if the timing was wrong, or the ground was uneven, or someone panicked, it became a disaster very quickly. A fallen knight was not a nimble fighter. Armor was heavy. It restricted movement. Once on the ground, a knight was vulnerable, expensive, and very aware of his mortality. And horses, bless them, were not enthusiastic about running directly into walls of sharp metal. They needed training. Lots of it. Even then, they sometimes refused, which added an element of awkwardness to the proceedings. Archers, meanwhile, were doing quiet, patient work in the background, or the foreground, depending on where they were standing. Bows were powerful. Longbows especially could send arrows terrifying distances with alarming force. They were not precision sniper tools, but they didn't need to be. Their job was to disrupt, wound, and unsettle. An arrow that did not kill still removed a soldier from the fight. A wounded man slowed others down. He screamed, he bled. He made morale noticeably worse. And morale in medieval battles was everything. Battles were rarely decided by total annihilation. They were decided by who lost confidence first, who broke ranks, who decided that survival was suddenly more important than loyalty. Once a formation collapsed, things ended quickly. A retreat became a rout. A rout became a massacre. The battlefield was no place for dignity once fear took over. Leadership mattered deeply. Commanders had limited ways to communicate: flags, horns, messengers yelling themselves hoarse. If orders were clear and timely, armies functioned. If not, confusion spread like a bad rumor, and confusion, in medieval warfare, was almost always fatal. It's important to understand that medieval battles were exhausting, not just physically, but mentally. Armor heated the body, weapons weighed down the arms, fear tightened the chest. Most men could not fight effectively for hours. Battles were often decided in less than an hour, sometimes in minutes. The idea of an all-day battle was rare, and usually a sign that something had gone terribly wrong for everyone involved. Religion played its quiet role as well. Soldiers prayed before battle. They carried charms. They believed God favored their side, naturally. Both sides usually believed this, which made the outcome awkward. Faith provided comfort. It also provided explanations after the fact. Victory meant divine approval. Defeat meant mysterious divine testing. After battles ended, the field was silent. Uncomfortably so, broken only by groans, prayers, and the practical business of looting. Armor was stripped. Weapons were collected. The dead were sorted by usefulness. Medieval warfare was not romantic to those who lived through it. It was efficient, harsh, and deeply human. So as we gently settle into this understanding, remember, medieval battles were not chaos. They were order strained to its limits, discipline tested by fear, and survival decided by who managed to hold together just a little longer than the other side. Let's rest there for a moment. Let the sounds of clashing steel fade, and when you're ready, we'll drift onward, deeper into the quiet mechanics of medieval war. Warfare in the Middle Ages was governed by strategy long before swords ever crossed. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. If you're not, then I'm doing my job correctly. Tonight, we're drifting a little deeper into medieval warfare. Not the loud part, not the clashing steel or heroic last stands, but the quiet, slow-thinking part that happened long before anyone picked up a weapon. Because medieval warfare, despite its reputation, was not decided by who shouted loudest or swung hardest. It was decided by planning, by patience, and by men sitting in tents staring at maps they barely understood, convinced they were military geniuses. Before any battle, there was waiting, so much waiting. Armies moved slowly. Supplies moved even more slowly. And commanders had to consider things like food, weather, morale, and whether their soldiers were already tired of sleeping in damp fields. A medieval army that marched without thinking quickly became a medieval army that starved or froze, or wandered into terrain that actively hated them. Strategy began with location, always location, where to march, where to camp, where not to camp under any circumstances unless you enjoyed dysentery. Generals preferred defensible positions, high ground, obviously, but also narrow passes, river crossings, and places where the enemy could not easily surround them. Open fields were risky, forests were worse. Forests hid ambushes, confused formations, and made it impossible to see what was about to go terribly wrong. So commanders avoided fighting unless they believed the conditions favored them. This meant that battles were surprisingly rare compared to sieges. And when battles did happen, it was usually because someone believed, often incorrectly, that they had the advantage. Let's talk about timing, because medieval warfare was deeply concerned with when something happened. Armies did not fight at dawn because it looked dramatic. They fought then because soldiers were rested. As rested as one can be after sleeping on the ground anyway. Weather mattered enormously. Rain turned fields into mud. Mud swallowed boots. Boots mattered. A knight stuck in mud was not a knight for long. He was an obstacle. Winter campaigns were avoided whenever possible. Cold killed morale faster than enemy arrows, and snow made supply lines a nightmare. Naturally, some rulers insisted on winter campaigns anyway, because of course they did, and naturally they regretted it. Now, strategy also involved knowing your enemy, or at least pretending to. Spies existed. Scouts rode ahead. Messengers brought news that was sometimes accurate, sometimes optimistic, and sometimes complete fiction. Commanders had to decide whether the enemy was weak, strong, hungry, confident, or already falling apart internally. And medieval armies fell apart internally all the time, which brings us gently to the people in charge. Kings, princes, nobles with impressive titles and questionable judgment. Many medieval rulers led armies personally. This was seen as noble. It was also risky, but they believed their presence inspired loyalty. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it just meant the army had to wait while the king finished breakfast. Royal strategy meetings were fascinating affairs. Imagine a room full of men who believed leadership was hereditary, debating complex military decisions with absolute confidence. Some were brilliant, many were not. Strategy could be undone by pride, by impatience, by the desire to prove something to a rival cousin who also believed he deserved the throne. And there were always rival cousins. Marching an army was expensive, painfully expensive. Soldiers needed food. Horses needed more food. Armor needed maintenance. So battles were often fought not to destroy the enemy completely, but to force a decision. To break morale, to make the other side give up. This is why positioning mattered so much. If you could cut off supply routes, you didn't need to fight at all. You just waited. Waiting was a weapon, a slow one, but very effective. Now let's drift toward the idea of feudal obligations. Because medieval armies were not professional standing forces most of the time, many soldiers were obligated to serve for a limited period. 40 days was common. After that, they expected to go home. This put pressure on commanders. They had a deadline. And if they failed to achieve something before time ran out, the army simply dissolved. Imagine trying to run a war with a ticking clock and no extension policy. Naturally, this led to rushed decisions, poor planning, and battles fought sooner than they should have been. Strategy also meant understanding morale. An army that believed it would win often did. An army that doubted itself rarely recovered. This is why banners mattered, standards, symbols. If a banner fell, soldiers believed the battle was lost, even if it wasn't, especially if it wasn't. So protecting symbols became strategic priorities, not because they had tactical value, but because humans are emotional creatures who panic easily. Medieval commanders knew this. Some exploited it ruthlessly. Let's also talk about communication, because it was terrible. No radios, no instant updates. Orders traveled by messenger or signal, and signals could be misread. A horn blast could mean advance or retreat, depending on who heard it and how tired they were. Flags could be obscured by dust. Messengers could be intercepted, or confused, or both. So strategies had to be simple, flexible, or at least hopeful. Complex plans rarely survived first contact with reality. And reality, in medieval warfare, was stubborn. Now, rulers often believed strategy was a personal talent, something they were born with, along with divine approval. This belief led to some truly impressive miscalculations. Kings underestimated enemies, ignored advisors, charged into unfavorable terrain because backing down felt embarrassing. And embarrassment, for medieval elites, was apparently worse than death. Many royal lives ended because of poor strategic judgment, which sounds dramatic, but at the time it was considered unfortunate rather than surprising. Strategy also extended beyond the battlefield. Wars were political, dynastic, marriages were strategies, alliances were strategies. Sometimes battles were fought simply to send a message. Often the message was, "Please take me seriously," and sometimes it worked. So before any swords crossed, decisions had already shaped the outcome. Who marched where they marched when they stopped, what they ate, who led them. By the time two armies faced each other, The battle had already begun quietly, slowly, and methodically. Steel would finish what strategy had started. So let's rest here for a moment. Let the maps roll themselves back up. Let the generals finish arguing in low voices. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again, toward the ground itself, because next the land will have its say. Terrain often mattered more than numbers, deciding victory before battle began. If you're listening with one eye already closed, you're exactly where you should be. Tonight, we're drifting down onto the ground itself, the soil, the hills, the rivers that quietly ruined careers. Because in the Middle Ages, terrain did not care how brave you were, or how noble your lineage was, or how many banners you brought along for morale. The land always had the final vote. Medieval commanders understood this, at least in theory. Some understood it very well. Others nodded politely and then ignored it completely, usually to impressive effect. Let's start gently with hills, because hills were everything. High ground was not a poetic concept. It was practical. Standing above your enemy meant better visibility, better footing, and gravity quietly assisting every downward strike. An army uphill was tired before the fighting even began. Armor felt heavier, breathing came faster, and every step forward felt like a negotiation with your own legs. Naturally, many medieval battles were decided before they started simply because one side refused to give up a hill. They would wait and wait and wait some more. Sometimes the waiting worked. Sometimes it just gave everyone time to become hungry and irritable. Now let's drift toward rivers, because rivers were polite-looking assassins. Crossing a river with an army was slow. Dangerously slow. Soldiers had to wade, swim, or use bridges that immediately became choke points. A man halfway across a river was not a warrior. He was a problem. Armor dragged him down. Weapons were awkward, and formation, so precious on land, simply dissolved. Smart commanders waited until the enemy was mid-crossing, then attacked. Less smart commanders attempted to cross anyway, usually because they were in a hurry or offended, or convinced the enemy would never dare attack them. The enemy almost always dared. Then there were marshes. Marshes were worse. Marshes looked harmless. Green, quiet, almost peaceful, but marshy ground swallowed boots, slowed horses, and turned coordinated movements into confused shuffling. A knight stuck in mud was no longer terrifying. He was a stationary investment. Some medieval rulers learned this lesson painfully. Others insisted marshes could be conquered through confidence alone. They were incorrect. Forests were another problem entirely. Forests hid enemies. They broke formations. They muffled sound. An army entering a forest lost control almost immediately. Units separated, orders vanished into trees, and ambushes became inevitable. This is why many medieval armies avoided forests unless forced. And when forced, they moved slowly, very slowly. Speed was the enemy of survival in unfamiliar terrain. Open fields, on the other hand, were preferred, but only if the ground was dry. Rain turned open fields into mud traps. Mud clung to boots, horse ease slipped, cavalry charges lost momentum, and momentum was everything for cavalry. A charge without speed was just a group of tired men politely approaching danger. Weather and terrain worked together like conspirators. Rain, snow, heat all reshaped the battlefield. Hot days exhausted soldiers quickly. Armor trapped heat. Water supplies ran low. Cold stiffened fingers. Weapons became harder to grip. Morale dropped. Winter battles were especially unpleasant. Cold killed more men than combat, but some rulers insisted on winter campaigns anyway, because naturally they did. They believed surprise would compensate for frostbite. It rarely did. Now let's talk about roads, or the lack of them. Medieval roads were inconsistent at best. Some were ancient Roman constructions, still clinging stubbornly to usefulness. Others were little more than suggestions. Moving an army required passable routes. Carts needed space. Horses needed stable ground. If supply wagons got stuck, the army starved. Simple as that. so terrain influenced logistics just as much as combat. An army with poor supply lines was already defeated. It just hadn't realized it yet. Commanders who understood terrain chose where battles happened. They maneuvered, they waited, they forced enemies into disadvantageous positions, sometimes without ever drawing a sword. Less patient commanders rushed. They marched straight toward the enemy, assuming numbers would solve everything. Numbers rarely solved anything on uneven ground. A smaller force, well positioned, could defeat a larger one easily. This happened often enough that it should have discouraged reckless planning. It did not, because medieval elites were deeply confident people. Terrain also affected visibility. Hills blocked sightlines, fog rolled in unexpectedly. An army that could not see was an army that panicked. Mistaken identities happened. Units attacked allies. Retreats turned into chaos, and chaos was unforgiving. Now let's drift briefly into castles, because castles were terrain turned into architecture. Castles were built where the land already favored defense. On hills, near rivers, above narrow approaches. Their placement was strategic first, aesthetic second. Sieges, which were far more common than battles, revolved entirely around terrain. Access to water, supply routes, nearby forests for timber. A castle with good terrain could hold out for months, sometimes years. An army besieging a poorly positioned castle might as well have stayed home. This is why medieval warfare involved so much staring. Staring at walls, staring at hills, staring at each other across fields. Nothing moved quickly. And then there were towns. Towns complicated terrain. Streets funneled movement. Buildings blocked lines of sight. Urban fighting was rare and avoided whenever possible. It was unpredictable, messy, and it favored locals who knew where everything was. Now let's not forget the psychological effect of terrain. Soldiers felt safer on high ground, more vulnerable in valleys. Confidence mattered. If men believed the land favored them, they fought better. If they believed the land was against them, morale cracked. Commanders exploited this. They chose camps that looked strong. They avoided positions that felt exposed. Even superstition played a role. Certain landscapes were considered unlucky or cursed. Medieval soldiers were practical, but also deeply human. Terrain shaped movement, timing, and outcome. It was the quiet participant in every battle. Kings could shout, generals could plan, but the land remained unmoved. Many great medieval defeats can be traced back to poor terrain choices. A hill ignored, a river underestimated, a marsh dismissed. The survivors always remembered. The dead, of course, did not. So when we think of medieval warfare, it helps to picture the battlefield before the soldiers arrive. Empty, silent, the hills waiting, the rivers flowing, the ground indifferent. The battle was already decided in part, simply by where it would happen. Let's rest there for now. Let the armies pause at the edge of the field, and when you're ready, we'll drift onward again. Because next we'll talk about the tools men carried onto that ground, and how much faith they placed in metal, leather, and hope. Armor and weapons were tools of survival, not symbols of invincibility. If your thoughts are starting to wander pleasantly, that's perfect. Let them drift. I'll handle the history. Tonight, we're easing into the quiet, clinking world of medieval armor and weapons, the things people trusted with their lives, often far more than was reasonable. Because despite what paintings, tapestries, and very optimistic legends suggest, armor was not magic. It did not make you invulnerable. It did not turn you into a walking fortress. It simply gave you a slightly better chance of surviving a very bad day. Let's start with armor itself, because armor was not one thing. It was many compromises stacked together. Early medieval armor was mostly mail, chainmail to be precise, thousands of small metal rings linked together by patient, very tired craftsmen. Mail was flexible, it moved with the body, it protected well against slashing blows, It did almost nothing against blunt force, or arrows at close range or exhaustion. A man wearing mail still felt every hit. The armor spread the impact, yes, but bruises, broken bones, and internal injuries were common, and mail was heavy. Not unbearably so, but enough that after hours of movement, the body began to complain. Loudly. Later came plate armor, the sort everyone imagines immediately. Shiny, solid, impressive. Plate armor was excellent protection when properly made and fitted. It deflected blows, turned blades, sometimes even stopped arrows, but it was expensive, extremely expensive. Only the wealthiest elites could afford full plate. And even then, it required constant maintenance. Rust was relentless, straps broke, hinges failed. Armor that did not fit perfectly was worse than no armor at all. It rubbed, restricted movement, chafed skin raw. A knight in ill, fitting armor suffered quietly and continuously. Now, despite modern myths, armored knights were not clumsy. They could run, they could climb, they could fight. For a while, fatigue was the real enemy. Armor trapped heat. Breathing became labored, sweat pooled. After enough time, even the best-equipped soldier slowed down, and slowing down in battle was dangerous. Now let's drift toward helmets, because helmets saved lives and ruined vision in equal measure. Helmets protected the skull. Naturally, that mattered, but they limited sight. Sound was muffled. Peripheral awareness vanished. A man in a helmet often relied on others to warn him of danger, which worked well until it didn't. Some helmets had narrow eye slits. Great for stopping blades, terrible for seeing what was happening. Many soldiers lifted their visors in the heat of combat, and paid for it. Protection was always a trade-off. Now let's talk about weapons, because weapons were not designed for elegance. They were designed for efficiency. The spear remained the most common weapon throughout the Middle Ages. Again, long, cheap, effective, swords were sidearms, not primary weapons, despite their reputation. Swords were symbols of status. They were personal. They were carried with pride. But on the battlefield, spears and polearms did the real work. Axes were brutal. They concentrated force. They crushed through armor joints. Maces existed for one reason. Armor worked. Blunt force bypassed it. A mace did not need to cut. It just needed to hit. And when it did, bones broke. Weapons evolved in response to armor. Armor evolved in response to weapons. It was a constant conversation. A very violent one. Now let's gently consider shields, because shields were lifesavers. Shields blocked arrows. Absorbed blows created mobile cover. They were lightweight compared to armor, flexible in use. Infantry relied heavily on shields. Shield walls were common, effective. Breaking a shield wall required coordination, or cavalry, or both. Shields fell out of favor later as plate armor improved, but for centuries they were essential. Now, let's pause briefly to acknowledge that weapons and armor did not guarantee survival. They merely postponed death. Most soldiers did not die from clean, cinematic sword wounds. They died from infection, from shock, from untreated injuries. A small cut could become fatal. Medical knowledge was limited. Hygiene was optimistic. Even nobles were not spared this reality. Their armor protected them in battle. But afterward, a wound could linger. Days later, fever set in, and then nothing dramatic, just quiet deterioration. So armor did not make war safe. It made it survivable, sometimes. Now let's drift into the psychology of armor. Because belief mattered, a soldier who trusted his armor fought differently, with more confidence, more aggression. This could be useful. It could also be fatal. Overconfidence led to mistakes, risks taking. Charging when holding would have been wiser. Many knights died because they believed their armor made them untouchable. It did not. Weapons, too, carried emotional weight. A sword was not just a tool. It was identity. Knights named their swords, prayed over them, passed them down. Losing a weapon felt personal, humiliating. This attachment could be dangerous. A man might fight to retrieve a fallen sword rather than retreat. Honor often outweighed survival. Now let's talk briefly about the maintenance burden, because medieval warfare involved constant upkeep. Armor needed cleaning, oiling, repair, weapons needed sharpening, handles replaced, edges maintained. An army that neglected equipment paid for it later. Blades dulled, armor failed, campaigns were long, supplies limited, rust never slept. Soldiers spent hours caring for gear, often in poor conditions. Cold, rain, mud. War was as much labor as combat. Now, let's gently acknowledge that many soldiers had neither good armor nor good weapons. Peasant levies fought with whatever they had. Improvised weapons, hand-me-down armor, poor protection. They relied on numbers, formation, luck. Elite warriors had advantages, but even elites died. Armor equalized risk. It did not remove it. And when armor failed, when a strap broke, when a visor jammed, when a plate shifted, panic followed. Because suddenly, the illusion of safety vanished. Weapons and armor were tools, not guarantees. Medieval warfare punished arrogance. Frequently, those who survived understood this. They respected their equipment, but they did not worship it. They trusted discipline, formation, the men beside them. Steel mattered, but not as much as coordination. So when we picture medieval warriors gleaming in armor, standing confidently beneath banners, it helps to remember what they knew. That armor was heavy, weapons were tiring, and survival was uncertain. They fought anyway, not because they were invincible, but because they were human. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the armor be set down. Let the weapons grow quiet. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again, because next we'll talk about the people behind the armor, the formations, the roles, and how cooperation mattered far more than individual heroics. Infantry, cavalry, and archers each had distinct roles that depended on cooperation. If your breathing has slowed a little, good. If not, that's fine too. We'll get there eventually. Tonight, we're drifting gently into the human machinery of medieval armies. Not the individuals, not the heroic portraits, but the groups, the parts that only worked when they worked together. For a while, fatigue was the real enemy. Armor trapped heat. Breathing became labored, sweat pooled. After enough time, even the best-equipped soldier slowed down, and slowing down in battle was dangerous. Now let's drift toward helmets, because helmets saved lives and ruined vision in equal measure. Helmets protected the skull. Naturally, that mattered, but they limited sight. Sound was muffled. Peripheral awareness vanished. A man in a helmet often relied on others to warn him of danger, which worked well until it didn't. Some helmets had narrow eye slits. Great for stopping blades, terrible for seeing what was happening. Many soldiers lifted their visors in the heat of combat, and paid for it. Protection was always a trade-off. Now let's talk about weapons, because weapons were not designed for elegance. They were designed for efficiency. The spear remained the most common weapon throughout the Middle Ages. Again, long, cheap, effective, swords were sidearms, not primary weapons, despite their reputation. Swords were symbols of status. They were personal. They were carried with pride. But on the battlefield, spears and polearms did the real work. Axes were brutal. They concentrated force. They crushed through armor joints. Maces existed for one reason. Armor worked. Blunt force bypassed it. A mace did not need to cut. It just needed to hit. And when it did, bones broke. Weapons evolved in response to armor. Armor evolved in response to weapons. It was a constant conversation. A very violent one. Now let's gently consider shields, because shields were lifesavers. Shields blocked arrows. Absorbed blows created mobile cover. They were lightweight compared to armor, flexible in use. Infantry relied heavily on shields. Shield walls were common, effective. Breaking a shield wall required coordination, or cavalry, or both. Shields fell out of favor later as plate armor improved, but for centuries they were essential. Now, let's pause briefly to acknowledge that weapons and armor did not guarantee survival. They merely postponed death. Most soldiers did not die from clean, cinematic sword wounds. They died from infection, from shock, from untreated injuries. A small cut could become fatal. Medical knowledge was limited. Hygiene was optimistic. Even nobles were not spared this reality. Their armor protected them in battle. But afterward, a wound could linger. Days later, fever set in, and then nothing dramatic, just quiet deterioration. So armor did not make war safe. It made it survivable, sometimes. Now, let's drift into the psychology of armor. Because belief mattered, a soldier who trusted his armor fought differently, with more confidence, more aggression. This could be useful. It could also be fatal. Overconfidence led to mistakes, risks taking. Charging when holding would have been wiser. Many knights died because they believed their armor made them untouchable. It did not. Weapons, too, carried emotional weight. A sword was not just a tool. It was identity. Knights named their swords, prayed over them, passed them down. Losing a weapon felt personal, humiliating. This attachment could be dangerous. A man might fight to retrieve a fallen sword rather than retreat. Honor often outweighed survival. Now let's talk briefly about the maintenance burden, because medieval warfare involved constant upkeep. Armor needed cleaning, oiling, repair. Weapons needed sharpening, handles replaced, edges maintained. An army that neglected equipment paid for it later. Blades dulled, armor failed, campaigns were long. Supplies limited, rust never slept. Soldiers spent hours caring for gear, often in poor conditions. Cold, rain, mud. War was as much labor as combat. Now, let's gently acknowledge that many soldiers had neither good armor nor good weapons. Peasant levies fought with whatever they had. Improvised weapons, hand-me-down armor, poor protection. They relied on numbers, formation, luck. Elite warriors had advantages, but even elites died. Armor equalized risk. It did not remove it. And when armor failed, when a strap broke, when a visor jammed, when a plate shifted, panic followed. Because suddenly, the illusion of safety vanished. Weapons and armor were tools, not guarantees. Medieval warfare punished arrogance. Frequently, those who survived understood this. They respected their equipment, but they did not worship it. They trusted discipline, formation, the men beside them. Steel mattered, but not as much as coordination. So when we picture medieval warriors gleaming in armor, standing confidently beneath banners, it helps to remember what they knew. That armor was heavy, weapons were tiring, and survival was uncertain. They fought anyway, not because they were invincible, but because they were human. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the armor be set down. Let the weapons grow quiet. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward again, because next we'll talk about the people behind the armor. The formations, the roles, and how cooperation mattered far more than individual heroics. Infantry, cavalry, and archers each had distinct roles that depended on cooperation. If your breathing has slowed a little, good. If not, that's fine too. We'll get there eventually. Tonight, we're drifting gently into the human machinery of medieval armies. Not the individuals, not the heroic portraits, but the groups. The parts that only worked when they worked together. Because medieval warfare was not a solo performance. It was a group project. And like most group projects, it went best when everyone did their job and did not improvise. Let's begin calmly and respectfully with the infantry, because infantry were everywhere. They were the bulk. The mass, the quietly enduring presence holding everything else together. Infantry were foot soldiers, men who walked to war, often for days, sometimes weeks. They were not glamorous. They did not inspire poetry. They inspired payroll problems. Most infantry carried spears, pikes, or polearms. weapons that rewarded discipline more than strength. Stand here, hold this angle, do not break, and that last part, do not break, was the most important. Infantry fought in formations. Lines, blocks, walls of bodies and wood and metal. A single infantryman was vulnerable. 100 together were formidable. This is why training mattered. Even minimal training, learning to stay close, to match pace, to trust the man beside you not to suddenly flee. Of course, sometimes he did flee, but ideally he didn't. Infantry absorbed punishment. They held ground. They waited. Waiting was their specialty. Now let's drift slowly toward the cavalry, because cavalry were dramatic, expensive, and extremely confident about their importance. Cavalry meant horses, which meant wealth, which meant nobility. Most cavalry were knights or men closely associated with them. They trained from youth. They learned to ride, to fight, to fall without dying. They believed, often sincerely, that they were the decisive force. Sometimes they were right. Cavalry existed to strike, to exploit weakness, to break formations at the right moment. The key phrase here is the right moment. A cavalry charge into a steady infantry line was a disaster. Horses refused, men fell, momentum died, but a cavalry charge into a wavering line, into tired soldiers, into confusion that could end a battle very quickly. So cavalry depended on infantry to soften the enemy first, to pin them, to tire them. Infantry depended on cavalry to finish things, to pursue, to prevent regrouping. Neither worked well alone. Now let's drift to the archers, quiet, patient, often underestimated. Archers were not there to duel. They were there to shape the battlefield. They fired from distance. They disrupted formations. They wounded rather than killed. A wounded soldier was a logistical problem. He needed help. He slowed others down. He screamed. Screaming mattered. Archers broke morale long before lines met. They forced shields up, heads down. This created openings. Moments that infantry and cavalry could use. Archers needed protection. They were vulnerable up close. Lightly armored, infantry often shielded them. Cavalry intercepted threats. Again, cooperation. Now, medieval commanders understood these roles. At least in theory, they arranged armies accordingly. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, archers positioned for maximum effect. This arrangement was not decorative. It was functional. When it worked, battles flowed. When it didn't, chaos followed, and chaos was not romantic. Let's talk briefly about what happened when cooperation failed. Because it did, often. Cavalry sometimes charged too early, because they were eager, or bored, or insulted. This left infantry exposed. Lines broke, the battle unraveled. Archers sometimes ran out of arrows, or were overrun, leaving advancing infantry unsupported. Infantry sometimes panicked. Once one man ran, others followed. A formation collapsing was like a crack in ice. It spread fast. Now, medieval elites, especially knights, had a complicated relationship with cooperation. They valued honor, individual bravery, personal reputation. This occasionally conflicted with teamwork. A knight might charge ahead to prove something, to be seen, to earn glory, and in doing so, disrupt the plan entirely. Commanders hated this. Quietly, publicly, they praised bravery. Privately, they sighed. Royal commanders were especially prone to dramatic gestures. Kings wanted to be visible. They wanted credit. This sometimes put them in danger and put the army in awkward situations. An army could not easily retreat if the king was still charging forward. Naturally, some kings insisted on this anyway. Now let's drift toward communication, because cooperation required it, and medieval communication was limited. Orders traveled slowly, signals were crude. A flag might mean advance or hold, depending on context. A horn blast could be misheard or ignored, so cooperation depended on pre-battle planning, on shared expectations. Soldiers needed to know what to do without being told in the moment. This is why drills mattered, why formations were practiced repeatedly. Muscle memory replaced instruction. Now, let's consider the social structure of medieval armies, because cooperation was also social. Infantry were often commoners. Cavalry were nobles. This created tension. Nobles often underestimated infantry, despite relying on them completely. Infantry noticed this. They remembered it. Mutual respect was not guaranteed, but mutual dependence was unavoidable. When cooperation broke down socially, it broke down tactically. Armies with deep internal divisions struggled. Armies with shared purpose fared better. This is why some commanders emphasized unity. Common cause, shared faith, shared enemy, anything to bind people together. Now let's drift gently into fatigue. Because cooperation was hardest when everyone was tired. After hours of marching, standing, holding formation, coordination slipped, mistakes happened. This is why battles were often short. Armies could not maintain cohesion indefinitely. A fresh reserve mattered enormously. Fresh troops could stabilize a line or break one. Commanders who managed reserves well often won. Those who committed everything too early did not. Now let's talk about pursuit. Because cooperation did not end when the enemy broke. Infantry could not pursue quickly. Cavalry could. Cavalry prevented regrouping, captured prisoners, turned defeat into disaster, but uncontrolled pursuit was dangerous. Cavalry could be lured away, ambushed. So even victory required discipline, which brings us to the quiet truth of medieval warfare. The best armies were boring. They followed plans, they waited. They did not chase every opportunity. They cooperated. The worst armies were dramatic, full of individual heroics and unnecessary risks. Those armies made good stories. They did not last long. Now let's gently consider the psychological comfort of cooperation. Standing alone is terrifying. Standing with others is survivable. Medieval soldiers clung to formation not just tactically, but emotionally. The man beside you mattered. His shield, his spear, his presence. When cooperation worked, fear was manageable. When it failed, fear took over. So infantry, cavalry, and archers were not separate entities. They were parts of a whole. Each depended on the others. Each compensated for weaknesses. And when they worked together, medieval armies were surprisingly effective. Not elegant, not merciful, but effective. So as we let this settle, imagine the battlefield again. But this time not as individuals. As movement, as patterns, lines advancing, arrows falling, horses waiting. Each group doing its part. Quietly, relentlessly. Let's rest here for a moment. Let the formations hold, and when you're ready, we'll drift onward once more. Because next, we'll talk about leadership, and how one voice, calm or panicked, could decide everything. And so, as the banners lower and the field finally grows quiet, we can leave the medieval world where it belongs, resting in the dark, softly lit by memory and moonlight. The soldiers have long since gone home. The kings have stopped shouting. The armor has been set down, piece by piece, to cool in the night air. All that remains now are the stories, slow ones, heavy ones, the kind that don't rush anywhere. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. History has a way of keeping gentle company. And if you've drifted off somewhere along the way, then I'm glad I could walk beside you for a while. Thank you for spending your evening here with me, where battles are quiet, ambition fades, and even kings eventually have to sleep. Rest well, and I'll see you next time, somewhere deep in the past.